Please turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. By the way, it was announced, don't remember. Oh, no, don't forget. Please remember. Next week, our 5 o'clock service becomes 12:30. We have worship, we eat, and we have worship at 12:30. So please remember that change. We have been studying, of course, 1 Corinthians. As last leaders have studied 1 and 2 Corinthians. And there's a lot of truths that we need to learn and a lot of things we need to apply. And I think some of the more challenging things to learn and apply are in chapters 8, 9, and 10. He's focusing on something unique to the first century, more so than now, because it had to do with the eating of meats offered to idols. You see, the last time I checked, I don't even know where you'd get any meat offered to idols. I don't think Winn-Dixie carries it. I don't think Publix has it. So someone might step back and say, does this have any bearing on us? Yes. Absolutely. Because in the process, what we're learning is how important the brother is and how important it is not to cause him to stumble. And I do say stumble. Sometimes we will use this word, offend or offense. And in a modern way, we're kind of meaning, I don't like it. That's not the point here. There are some things maybe we might not like, and we just got to put up with it, okay? It's not wrong. Maybe I just don't like it. I need to learn to put up with it. Somebody might say, well, give me an example of that. Well, okay. I can promise you this right now. There they are, thermostats. Somebody right now is hot, and somebody is cold. And you may not like the temperature in here, but it's not right or not wrong, and we just have to learn to deal with it. We're not talking about just, I don't like it. It's rather something that would cause the brother to stumble. It messes with his faith. It messes with his Christian life. And in this instance, it's like a new Christian coming out of idolatry. And while it's acknowledged in chapter 8, an idol is nothing, we dealt with that. Still in all, he's just not comfortable. And it's like he's got still one foot in idolatry. And to see the brother then eat meats offered to idols. And in a very specific way, it mentions eating in an idol's temple in verse 10 of chapter 8. It could be a problem to him. And then here's what we read. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, an idol's nothing, will he not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food offered to idols? And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. Thus, sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it was weak, you sin against Christ. Then he makes a bold statement. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. Now, I'm not meaning to repeat our study of chapter 8. It's just chapter 9 is predicated on chapter 8. It's based on it. You see, as you end up, he's saying, if it's going to cause him to stumble, I won't eat meat. But we might say, but it's my right to eat meat. It's okay to eat meat. An idol's nothing. And I know it. And then say it again, it's not right to eat meat. You see, that's when you get to chapter 9. And the entirety of chapter 9 is basically Paul saying, if it's for the greater good, I'll give up my rights. He's so un-American. You know, we are big on our rights, aren't we? In fact, because I couldn't remember them, I printed them all out. The Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments, helped the Constitution get passed. Amendment 1. You remember that one? That's the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. You remember Amendment number 2? The right to what? Bear arms. I probably don't remember number 3. Quartering of soldiers, more unique to its time. Amendment number 4, search and arrest. Amendment number 5, we remember that. I'll take the 5th. You don't have to, testify against yourself. And so on you go to number 10, Bill of Rights. We're big on. It's my right. How important is your brother? Paul's telling us he's so important. If it's going to make him stumble, you give up your rights. He starts in chapter 9, verse 1. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? First, there's 2 or 3 verses about his being an apostle. He says, have I not seen Jesus our Lord, his proof of apostleship? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. Now, this almost is a prelude to 2 Corinthians, where some were doubting his apostleship, and he had to fight against some false apostles. But I think it's even this, within this context. Listen, I'm an apostle. If anybody's got this right, I do. And then he begins to talk about rights. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right? This is the word exousia. Sometimes it's translated otherwise. Power or authority. All power, authority is given unto me in heaven and earth. So said Jesus. But in the sense of power or right to do something. Sometimes translated right. And so 5 times in this chapter we've got the word right. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? We've got the right to eat the meats. Then he moves on. Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? In other words, he's saying, I've got the right to do this. Verse 6, or is it not only Barnabas and I who have no rights to refrain from working for a living? And then he begins a discussion about kind of support of himself as preacher and apostle. You get over, though, to middle of verse 12, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. And then you get down to the last part of verse 18, I may present the gospel free of charge so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. He says right 5 times. And ultimately, it's kind of like Paul saying, I'm not pressing my rights. I'll give up my rights. But it's for the greater good of a brother in Christ. Now we find this introduction to the idea of, okay, Paul, can you be supported for your preaching and apostleship? Or do you have to, work a regular job? He introduces that really in verse 6. Then verse 7. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? He kind of points to some ordinary things that they understand. The soldier, he gets He gets paid for his work. And then the person who plants the vineyard or who tends the flock, he can eat of the fruit or get some of the milk from the flock. And once again, this would very much fit with their way of thinking, because in that day there would be some kind of absentee landlords, and then there would be a tenant farmer. And so he's tending to that vineyard, or maybe he has the flock, the absentee landlord. Well, it's understood. You get to eat of that vineyard, you get to have some of the milk from the flock. These ordinary things, yes, you could partake of them. Then in verse 8 he says, do I say these things on human authority? So he moves beyond just ordinary things and moves to Old Testament teaching, to the law. He says, does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. You read this in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 8. And so don't feel sorry for that ox. He does get to eat of the grain that he's treading out. But then he goes on to say, does he not certainly speak for our sake? For it was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. So he's making broader application than just the ox itself to us, and how we can, as it were, share in the bounty of that task in which we are doing. But then he kind of making the application beyond just the physical, verse 11, if we have sown spiritual things among you. Paul is an apostle of Jesus Christ, as a preacher of the gospel. He had sowed the spiritual things among them at Corinth. He says, is it too much if we reap material things from you? So we have the right to be supported in the teaching and preaching of the gospel. And then verse 12, if others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? So there have been already some others teaching, preaching, claimed that right to have the support of the Corinthian church. And Paul says, do not we even more? He is an apostle, having been the first to preach there in Corinth, as it were a founder of the church of the Lord there. Certainly he had that right. Again, this whole context is his right to be supported. But then there's the hint right here in middle of verse 12. Nevertheless, we've not made use of this right. You've got a number of verses where he's basically saying, it's my right to be supported. It's my right to be supported. I'm proving it by ordinary things. I'm proving it by the old law. And we're going to see further, he's going to prove it by the fact that, well, we've already noticed in this verse 12, others receive it. And we're going to even see verse 14, it's ordered by the Lord. But then he's going to also be saying, it's my right. But I can give up that right. He says, we've not made use of this right. Then look at the reason. But we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. I'll give up my right. I'll endure anything. So I don't put an obstacle in the way of the gospel. In verse 13, do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? You can go to Leviticus 6:16, Leviticus 6:26, Leviticus 7:6, Numbers chapter 5, verses 9 and 10, and chapter 8, verses 18 and following. And in the Old Testament, see that those who served in the temple, that they receive food from the temple. You know, this also would have been true of idolatry and those making sacrifice in those idol temples. So he's proved again and again. And finally, this last, verse 14, in the same way, look at this. The Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. And so even it was ordered by the Lord. So he's proved it in about 4 to 5 different ways. Paul had a right to be supported by the church at Corinth. But just as he had that right, he could also forego the right. And in verse 15 he says, "But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision." I'm not writing this asking you for help or for money. He says, "For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me." Now, I want to just stop just a second to say, it was not that Paul did not receive support from any church, but at Corinth, he decided it best there not to take it from the church at Corinth. In fact, in 2 Corinthians 12:13, he made note of robbing other churches. Robbing, don't take that quite in its literal meaning. But he took from other churches to do service at Corinth. We find particularly the church at Philippi, as you'd find in Philippians chapter 4, verses 15 through 17, they supported Paul. It sent him at least more than once. So it wasn't that he refused to take from any church, but though he had the right to take from Corinth, he did not. Once again, there was a reason. He did not want to hinder the gospel. Verse 17, "For if I do this of mine own will, I have a reward, but if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? This is my preaching. I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel." So he didn't take from the Corinthians. He gave up that right. Verse 19, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all." He's getting at the reason. He's getting at the reason on why he did not. You find the word "when" in verse 19. In verse 20 you find the word "when" at the first and at the last. In verse 21 you find the word "when." And then you get to verse 22, you find the word "save." And when he says "when," he's really speaking of saving those souls. And though he had the right to be supported by the church of Corinth, he gave up that right because he wanted to see the gospel preached and nothing hinder it. In verse 20, to what extent would he, as it were, give up his rights to the Jews? I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak that I might win the weak. So in all these instances, there's an element of he's giving up, making some changes, making some adjustments for the purpose of that soul, for the purpose of the salvation of another. And so you find, I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Verse 23, I do it all for the sake of the gospel. I do it all for the sake of the gospel. His primary concern the gospel, it being preached, the salvation of those who hear it. And then as they become a brother in Christ, they continue on that path of salvation. In verse 24, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? Once again, he's calling up something that they would be familiar with. Here in Corinth, there were the Isthmian Games, one of the Panhellenic games held other places such as Olympia and Delphi and Nemea. And so they understand the idea of the runners running. In fact, the track events, the running events, would be kind of center place of things that would take place in these games. But now, of course, in those games, only one receives the prize. And therein would be a bit of a difference between the Christian race and these games. And then he says, so run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. Here he's speaking, and then later as well, of the training that would take place so that he would be prepared to run the games. And it would be sometimes, wouldn't it, self-denial. It would be pushing oneself beyond what he might think are the limits so that he strengthens his body and he's ready for the games. And so we should take the Christian race just as serious. It said they do it to receive a perishable wreath. A perishable wreath. At Olympia, they received an olive wreath. At the Isthmian Games, a pine wreath. Last year on vacation, Tish and I went to a luau, and we got one of these leis, these flower things. And let's say this. It's great to have for 10 minutes. Otherwise, it's really nothing special. But we left ours behind. I really didn't think that they would let us bring it back to the United mainland because it's agricultural. But then I saw somebody on the airplane with one, and apparently they'll let you bring those back. Still, what's the point? Okay, it's made out of real flower petals. That's neat, but also, you know what it means? With a few days, and that thing's going to go from that reddish pink to yellow to brown to wither. Like he says, a perishable wreath. But he says, but we an imperishable. Think of the difference. They will put their body through its limits. They will train. They will come to the games prepared. And they just get a perishable wreath. But then what does the Christian get? In verse 6, so I do not run aimlessly. You don't go to heaven by accident. It is with aim, it is with purpose that we live the Christian life. He says, I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body, keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disciplined. You know, by the way, there's the implication here for the once saved, always saved doctrine. If Paul himself speaks that he, under certain circumstances, could be disqualified, it is very clear that once saved, always saved doctrine is not true. Who would ever doubt his salvation? No. Yes, absolutely, a saved man, Paul the Apostle. But yet he acknowledges, I could be disqualified. And so here he is intentional about his Christian life. But you know, you take chapters 8 and 9. Paul is in chapter 9 saying, I've got some rights. I'll forgo the rights for the good of you. Just like if there's this brother who could stumble and fall by the wayside and Christianity is lost to him, but what I do, even if I have the right, I'll give it up. I won't do it. When I read these chapters, what I walk away from is my brother is so important. I don't necessarily get to do what I want to do. My brother is so important, I don't necessarily have the option to do what I have the right to do. Not if he's as important to me as he ought to be. Actually, there are several passages in 1 Corinthians that we'd have to say speak so well of how important our brother is. And I hope your brother is important to you. If we could assist you in your walk with God tonight, either to help you begin by immersing you into Christ, or if there's a need for prayer, we'd be glad to take the time and pray for you. If you need to come, please come as we stand and sing.